I am Daniel Parker with the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction, and I'm joined by Kate McGinnity. Welcome, Kate.
Hello, everybody. Hi, Daniel.
You should have received an email with the handouts. I do put everything in Google folders, so this is a look at the Google folder here with all of the information. And you have the presentation materials and some additional materials there. If you have trouble accessing those materials, you can email me and post-webinar, and I will try to get those materials to you in a way that will work for you. If you or anyone you know did not register, so if you're in a group and you're with someone who did not register for today's webinar, so I am Daniel Parker. I'm the Autism and Family Engagement Consultant with the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction, but I don't want to spend our precious time today talking about myself. Kate, would you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background and your work with students with autism?
Sure, and again, since you guys all have this, I don't know that I want to spend a lot of our time speaking about me either. I think the main thing is that I'm a teacher by trade. You know, I started in the classroom, a special ed classroom, then collaborated with my general education colleagues in a much more inclusive model. I was a foster parent for a number of years to a young man with autism with significant behavioral challenges and a delightful smile and a charming heart. And I've been hanging out in the field for a long time, and I've done some writing, and I like to speak, and now I go into school districts and do troubleshooting.
All right, thank you. Well, we're very happy to have you here today on this, definitely important topic. I want to thank a couple people. We want to thank a couple people. Lisa Ladson from Imagine a Child's Capacity. She provided some of the content that we're using today, right, Kate?
Absolutely, yeah. Lisa and I worked together on this, and we're actually doing some additional writing, so stay tuned. We're doing additional writing on this topic.
And I also want to thank Susan Van Beaver from the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction. She works with cross-categorical leadership, special ed paraprofessionals. She also does some work around the educator effectiveness as a liaison from our special education team, and she helped me prepare for some of the information about the compliance point of view of working with paraprofessionals. All right, so that gets through our housekeeping, some presentation goals today. You know, we're going to talk, I'm going to go through fairly quickly because a lot of this is written down in compliance of the roles of paraprofessionals in terms of, compliance-related roles of paraprofessionals. We'll talk a little bit about other things that paraprofessionals do to support students and educators in schools. We're going to talk about some strategies for paras to assist students with autism. That's going to be a big piece. We're really looking at how do we help students become more independent and skillful. Some ideas to maximize scheduling, some strategies all paras should know, and some resources for further study. I'm not going to read through all the terms today, but they are in your handouts. If we use any terms that you're not sure about, just let us know as we move along, and we can discuss those. So a paraprofessional, just to kind of put this term out, we will discuss this one. We're using that to include teacher aides, teacher assistants, and instructional aides. Are there other terms you've heard in the schools?
One district I work in calls them special education assistants, SEAs.
That's right. I have heard that in Wisconsin, SEAs.
Yeah, SEAs.
Yep. Great. Really quickly, a couple of assumptions that Kate and I have. One is presuming competence about students with disabilities, and this comes into play with the interventions. And so, Kate, the interventions that we're talking about today, are these for just some students with autism or students across what people call the spectrum?
I really say that they're across the spectrum, and if you're listening and you're not understanding how something Daniel and I are talking about would apply to the students you're supporting, that would be a good question to type in, because then we could give you examples. We kind of we don't plan our examples, we just pull them out of the air based on our recent experience. So it's possible we might be giving an example and you just can't figure out how it applies to your student. Please ask, because this should go across the board.
Yeah. And I know Kate and I, we work a lot together to do the two-day autism trainings that Kate assists with DPI, and we always talk about helping students become more skillful, more independent, and that's a big piece of this. And we have a strong belief that students, even students that are nonverbal, may have some significant, maybe possibly self-injurious or a history of injury towards others, students that have a lot of movement needs, they are still all students are capable of increasing their independence.
Mm-hmm.
Great. And we also believe, and we want to make sure all of the paraprofessionals and educators and families out there understand that we both believe that paraprofessionals have a critical role in assisting students with autism. I always say they're kind of the backbone of a really strong program.
Absolutely. Yeah, and the way I say that is there are people that are usually in the trenches the most.
Yes.
They're the ones that are with our students, even our case managing teachers are, of course, too, and our gen educators, but our paraprofessionals really are what make it work or not for that student.
And for those of you, I started as a para many years ago, but that was my first introduction to working in schools. It wasn't what I had intended to do after college, so I just fell in love with it. And definitely, I know that also in some schools, I was lucky to have really good structure and professional development, but many times the paraprofessionals are in the trenches the most, but may receive the least amount of PD, unfortunately, in some cases.
I think that's one of the things I hear from our paraprofessionals that I work with. The most frequent is that they don't feel that they are adequately trained for what they're being asked to do. And what I hear from our case managing teachers is they don't have time to train.
Sure.
So I think that I'm just so grateful that Daniel is doing all these webinars this year because it's giving us, I think, an avenue to get some professional development for our parents.
Definitely. And there's more and more video resources and checklists and different things where there's a lot more ability than when I started for self-training.
Absolutely.
So we'll be sharing some of those resources as we move along. Again, we touched on this with students becoming more skillful, but also, many of you are probably listening because there are behaviors that interfere with learning that can be extremely difficult if you're a parent. That causes a lot of stress and anxiety for the family. If you are a teacher, that can be very difficult in working through a classroom routine. If you're a para or a teacher assistant working with a student, you feel that responsibility for that student. And we just want to keep in mind that, a lot of ways to work with behavior, people look for those quick fixes, but it's really there's many supports that really should be in place, and all of that behavior is communication.
Yeah. And I agree, Daniel, and that it changes over time, not overnight. And I think, I like how on this slide how Daniel has, it's communicative, it's functional, it's something we have to directly teach. And our colleague Judy Endo, who also does a lot of the 2-day DPI trainings with us in autism, she also has taught us to kind of tweak the way, kind of change our lens slightly and also think of behavior as a solution. How is the student using that behavior as a solution? It might be a sensory solution. It might be a neurological solution. So maybe that student is hitting somebody in the head because the pictures in his own head, neurologically are getting stuck. Well, it's not. It's a solution in that it meets his, the end product, but obviously that's not something we want our students to be doing. But once we figure out how the student is using that to communicate, how that behavior is functional, how that, how he might or she might be using it as a solution, then it helps us get to the kinds of behavioral supports that are going to change that behavior over time.
And some of those behavioral supports, because they don't happen overnight, we are going to change what we say, what we do, the types of accommodations that students have just to get them feeling safe and secure. Absolutely. And understanding and predicting and knowing what's happening. And that's going to really, for some students, that's going to look like, a very big difference to what many students may need at first. But the end goal is always to get them as independent as possible. So just keep that in mind as we're kind of talking about some of our interventions today. And again, we kind of talked about this. I like to use the term skillful and behavior differences and really thinking about our language, because it really, if we're thinking of things as being a deficit, then we kind of feel like there's maybe almost no hope. But if we just see them as differences and that we need to just teach something a little more skillfully, and we have to teach it, it can really help in how we feel about the work that we do as educators and families and professionals. I'm not going to spend much time at all on this, but just a reminder, and actually I did not update this slide apparently. Last time we did this, we were using the same presentation materials. Last time we did this presentation, it was 1 in 88. Now it's 1 in 60.
I think it's 68.
68.
Yeah, and that was just since December, guys.
Yeah,
so that's a big change.
And that 1 in 88 went from 1 in 100 within the last year too. So we're really seeing more and more students. It's not if, but when you will have a student or know a student with autism. We want to make sure that people understand if you met one person with autism, you met one person. So a lot of the interventions we're going to discuss really need to be tailored to that individual student. So let's talk about talking about effective use of paras, and let's talk about the definitions and licensing and roles. The IDEA, Individuals with Disability Education Act, which is a federal special education law, does use the term paraprofessionals, so that's one of the terms that I've used. And it allows paraprofessionals and assistants who are appropriately trained and supervised in accordance with state law, regulation, or written policy to be used to assist in the provision of special education and related services under the law for students with disabilities. So if you look at our Wisconsin Administrative Code, we use the term aid here. So that's why you kind of hear these different languages and terms around types of paraprofessionals. And you can see the definition there, and I'll read it really quick. It's a school employee who works under the direct supervision, and that is important as we move forward, the direct supervision of a licensed teacher in a district or school whose responsibilities include, but are not limited to, supporting the lesson plan of the licensed teacher, providing technical assistance to the teacher, helping with classroom control or management, and other duties as assigned. I would love to see that word control maybe change to classroom environment, but that's okay. Professional or aides in Wisconsin must hold the special education program aide license, and unless the individual holds any valid Wisconsin Department of Instruction license. So if you're a licensed teacher or have any other DPI license, that automatically qualifies you to be a aide in Wisconsin. Applicants must be at least 18 years of old in Wisconsin. They must be, the application is requested by actually the school district administrator employing that person. And really to look at the licensing, because I'm not a licensing professional, do please look up the DPI link for licensing, and I have that link below that talks about the additional requirements. We'll talk a little bit about a couple pieces of it though here now as well. Additional qualifications under the ESEA may imply in Title I school program. So just know that if you're a Title I school-wide program, there may be additional licensing requirements for teacher assistants. And again, you can find all of that information on the DPI website. Often we get questions about substitute teaching licenses. And if you have a substitute teaching license, that does count towards certification as a special education program aide in Wisconsin. So let's talk about these roles and responsibilities. This is probably the piece that I'm sure a lot of you are wondering about. So I bulleted some of these. Supporting instructional activities under the supervision of a licensed teacher, so helping out in the classroom with students, assisting with behavior management, access. They can have access to a student's IEP. We get that question sometimes. If a teacher assistant is working with a student with autism, they should have access to the IEP, or they should have the IEP summarized for them with the main accommodations and supports that that child requires that is in that IEP. That is critical.
I think it's critical as well, Daniel, and I think sometimes it's important as case managing teachers to remind our paraprofessionals when we're giving them access to these documents about the confidentiality clause. Which is that, that paraprofessional can talk to other people who have an educational investment in that student. So they can talk to the general ed teachers and the specials teachers and the administrators about what's in that student's IEP. But you can't really go in the lounge and chit-chat with somebody who's not working with that student, and I think that we have to just that's something that protects our special education students for a reason, and so we really have to make sure that we do get the information to the right people, and then when we give the information to the right people, remind them that that's a confidential document.
A good practice that we used to do is we would have meetings with everyone that's working with a student each quarter, semester, year, depending on the student's schedule, and we would sit down and we would usually kind of provide a summary. Usually we preferred not to have a lot of loose documents around. So we usually kept them in a place that was secure, but that if the paraprofessional or any teacher aide or anyone, general ed teacher who was working with the student wanted to access them, it was pretty easy for them to access it, but at the same time being secure. So, and Kate, thank you also for that confidentiality piece. That is very important. And there's a really good student confidentiality document on the DPI website as well that I can add to the Google document in our presentation materials. Another role is collaborating and reporting to teachers on the IEP team. Definitely not required, because sometimes people ask me what's required. It is not required for a paraprofessional to attend an IEP meeting like it is for a special educator, general educator, an administrator, but it is really good practice.
Mm-hmm.
If a paraprofessional is working with the student and has information to provide, especially if there's a functional behavior assessment for that student where they're trying to figure out, why are some behaviors happening, doing interviews with paras, including them in brainstorming, sometimes they have a perspective that the other educators and family may not have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I understand that sometimes if the IEP meeting is during the day, the paraprofessional, especially with that case managing teacher
Yes.
and that gen ed teacher being pulled, it's hard to then also pull the paraprofessional. But then I think, as Daniel said, it's so important to get that person's perspective, to take that 15 minutes and sit down and say, what do you think, how is it going, and what do you think it's important for us to discuss as a team? And even, where do you think we should go with goals? Not necessarily that person has to sign the IEP document, but if it's somebody that's working on a regular basis with a student, we really want to get that input however we can.
Aides and teacher assistants also have access to teacher lesson plans. Again, if you look at the top, this is what they're allowed to do. So there's no requirements on these things, but they are allowed to have access to teacher lesson plans. With the IEP meeting too, sometimes just to even prepare for the IEP meeting, sometimes the teachers meet with the family, so having the paraprofessional outside to discuss it and then be able to include information. There's different ways to work around those things as well. And they can proctor state assessments. We get that question. There are some requirements around that, so they have to be trained in test administration procedures. And as you may know, we have new state assessments rolling out next year. And I do not currently have access. I do have links to some new materials from the assessment, our assessment office, that I can put links to if people have questions about all of that, because there's a lot of new information for different types of tests, because there's ACT and there's Smarter Balance and there's different assessments at different ages. So I can send you information and links on our DPI page for information about assessments. Paras are also allowed to provide support services to students in a speech and language program, so we get that question occasionally. And there's a really good link on the speech and language web page that's here that has some great information. It goes really in depth. We get that question as well. And Cheryl Thorman at DPI here, one of my colleagues, is a good person if you have questions about any of the material on that website, but I would refer to that first. They do have to be under the direct supervision of a licensed, DPI licensed speech and language pathologist, and for review and reinforcement of the speech and language pathologist instruction. Similar to instruction, paras should not be creating new instruction or lesson plans or evaluation. Really, they're there to reinforce what has already been taught by a licensed instructor or a therapist.
Just before we leave that slide, Daniel, I think too, this is one of the places I sometimes think we underutilize our parapros in terms of, we all know communication happens across the day. It doesn't happen in, a 20-minute one-on-one, or even, only when that speech and language person is coming into the classroom, if that's the model that the therapy is being delivered. So I think it's just so vital, and along, kind of under that comes, providing the social support and sometimes coaching both sides of the interaction, both the student with autism and the peer, so that they can have a successful interaction, and and that's so much richer, I think, than what we sometimes get into as adults, which is speaking for the students, to the other students, but to really help facilitate those interactions, and that, has to go across the day.
Thank you. And so let's take a look at what Paras are not allowed to do. And these are the big pieces. And if you are a teacher assistant or a para and you see something on this list that you feel you are doing and you're not allowed, I would have a conversation with the case manager, with the teachers, with the administrator, because you really don't want to put yourself in a position to be, even that you may feel capable or feel wanting to do these things. Just know that, in terms of compliance, these things are not allowed for teaching assistants or aides in Wisconsin. So planning instruction, so developing lesson plans. Certainly they could be involved in collaboration of lesson plans, but actually the planning of new instruction solely by a para would not be allowed. Diagnosing learning needs, so that's assessment. Now they can proctor assessments, but that's for state assessments, and there's probably a lot of additional regulations around that, around training, but they should not be doing educational evaluations and assessments as part of the IEP. Evaluate effects of instruction, so they're not doing evaluation. They might be able to take data, so I think that there's a little bit of leeway with some basic data collection, but they're not looking at the effects of the instruction and making recommendations based. They're not doing like a program analysis of the data or an evaluation of the student's program and reporting that to families in the IEP. And determining the student's schedule for the day. So that's to be done by the IEP team or a special education teacher or administrator to look at the student's schedule for the day. And with that, determining the student's schedule of the day, I think of something Paula Kluth has said once about, a bunch of students are outside, a student requires in the IEP, it has a one-on-one assistant, the student needs some assistance. It starts raining outside, and the paraprofessional teacher aide brings the student back inside by themselves. All the other students are still outside. Thoughts on that, Kate?
Well, that's not really. I mean, that's determining that student's schedule, and if that student's schedule is to be with their peers at that time, we have to wait until all those other students are dismissed to come inside.
And I think the good thing to think about in those situations is just really good communication, because certainly, teacher assistants are people and they have certain needs at certain times and need to go to certain places, but that student, whatever's in that IEP for that student's day, whatever services and location, that's what's expected to be in there, not a person making those decisions on a day-to-day basis.
Right.
So just keep that in mind. Paras are also not allowed to write the IEP goals. Again, there can be collaboration, but not writing them solely and putting them in there. Being responsible for paperwork and reporting. Again, I would say some basic data collection would probably be reasonable, but when we talk about IEP paperwork and reporting, that is not allowed. And teacher assistants cannot act as a substitute teacher unless they are licensed as a substitute teacher or licensed as a teacher. So that's important to keep in mind too.
And that's not to say, like I've been in classrooms where the case managing or primary teacher is out sick, and there is a licensed substitute, but the paraprofessional leads the calendar routine because she's more familiar with it and the children are more familiar with her. There's nothing wrong with doing some of the things that the licensed teacher does if that teacher is out, as long as there is a licensed substitute, with the students as well.
Sure. I just wanted to pull up a quick, this is in your Google document binder. We have bulletins on various compliance-related information, and there's actually, you see the title of this is Frequently Asked Questions About Special Ed Paraprofessionals. So it goes over the definitions, it talks about what they can or can't do. There's lots of good information in here. So you can see there's questions about can they have access to the IEP and all of that type of information. So I pulled out, there's some additional information. You can see Susan Van Beaver. Contact number is there and her email address. She's a good person to contact on our team if you have specific paraprofessional questions. I am going to take a quick question that came in, and I don't know that we're going to be talking about this specifically later, but if a parent wants to have a paraprofessional as part of the IEP, So there's a question from a parent or family member of how does that process work? And basically, you know, those are IEP team decisions. You'll hear us say that a lot. There is no magic equation for this student has this disability, thus they get a para. There's no magic equation saying the student scored something on some assessment and must have this. You have to keep in mind that educational decisions are up to IEP teams, so medical documentation certainly should be considered, and parents are encouraged to bring medical documentation and information to IEP meetings so that the IEP team can discuss that along with the other information collected that schools are required to collect. But medical decisions do not dictate what's in an IEP either. So, you know, the best thing for parents to do is to discuss it at IEP meetings. And one of the things we're going to be talking about is this idea, and Kate's going to go into this here in a minute, about having a para is not always the best outcomes based on our research for students with autism. And we're going to get into that. So one of the recommendations I would say overall, when the question is how do we have a para, the question really is how do we provide, when do we need extra support, and how do we provide it? And a para certainly can do that, but as we will see, sometimes having a para right there all the time can actually limit progress of students with disabilities. Not to say that because of what they're trying to do or their skills, but students with autism are just more prone to being possibly prompt dependent than other students as well. But we're going to get into that in a second. Really quick, we're going to watch just a 2.5 minute, 3-minute video from the Organization for Autism Research that kind of does a nice summary of paras. So here's a little video for your viewing.
Paraprofessionals, people trained to work directly with students in the classroom, are another key source of support for teachers. In some school systems, paraprofessionals are also called instructional aides, or simply IAs.
The job of the paraprofessional is to help keep the learner with autism focused on the classroom teacher. Oftentimes what happens with an individual on the spectrum is when they start thinking about something different, that's it. And so the paraprofessional's job is to keep them refocused, keep refocusing them, and providing the kind of reinforcement they need for the work that they're doing when they actually are attending and paying attention.
The paraprofessional can make sure that the student is on task, that he has the materials, that the supports are needed, that if he has questions, our student, that he's prompted to ask the question.
Paraprofessionals are not responsible for developing curriculum content. Instead, they should be thought of as facilitators who help students with autism adapt to the classroom environment.
You know this one. What do you think he named?
Especially with students with autism, I think they are absolutely needed in the beginning as you're setting up. Last year I had a student with autism and he was pretty much an independent learner. The first few times he came, it was a disaster. The writing was on the wall. We needed to get him on track till he got into the routine. So I had asked for a paraprofessional to come in with him. I just needed him there to make sure that he was ready to go, to make sure he had his materials, to make sure that he wrote down in his agenda book the assignments, so that we could get him on the right track.
Paraprofessionals are central players in the success of a student with autism. So my message to teachers would be to really form a close partnership with the paraprofessional who's involved with that student, if there is one, and to include them in team decision-making contexts because they have so much information about the small ways in which that learner might be struggling that aren't observable when our attention is divided among 30 students.
Parents often find that a paraprofessional, when recommended for their child, can make a meaningful difference.
Paraprofessionals for Paul have been very supportive. They help him stay on target. They help him organize his work. He has abysmal handwriting, and if notes have to be taken quickly, they'll do it for him. They help script him when he gets in trouble a little bit. You know, Paul, why don't you go tell that girl that you didn't mean to do that? Or, Paul, maybe you should go take a walk out in the hallway for 5 minutes so that you can regroup right before something is going to happen.
All right. So Kate's going to jump in now, and I'm going to answer a couple questions that have come in as well while Kate is going to talk a little bit about these different perspectives of parents.
So when we think about how we look at a student, you know, it depends on obviously on our perspective. And when we look at the use of our paraprofessionals, it has to do with our perspective. A parent might have the perspective of, wow, you know, it makes me a lot less anxious about my student's school experience if I know there's a paraprofessional that's assigned to them for the majority of the day. A gen ed teacher might say, wow, it makes it a lot easier for me to think about including a student with autism or another disability in my classroom if I know I have an extra pair of hands in there to help out as needed. So I don't have to remember everything about that one student who might be a more complex learner in addition to my other 25 or 30 students, right? As a case managing student, as a case managing teacher, my perspective on having a paraprofessional might be, well, it's more work to plan for somebody. It's actually more work. I tell the story of back when I was teaching, and there was one year that I think I had 4 different paraprofessionals that I worked with. And I used to say, you know, by the time you say good morning and how was your weekend, your whole prep time is gone, you know, as a case managing teacher. And I respect that when I hear that from other case managing teachers. It's like you know, you want to be socially, you know, kind of connected to all these people you work with. But when you have a whole host of people that you're planning for and supervising, it adds to your job in some ways. And then in other ways, it would hopefully, you know, enhance the quality of the education for the students that are on your caseload and maybe make your job easier in some ways. So, you know, when we think about that in terms of what parents and families want for their children, those of you that are parents that are attending, feel free to add in here. But usually what we hear from parents, you know, if I am just talking to a group of 100 people and I say, you know, who are the parents and what do you want for your children, with or without disabilities? You know, people want them to be happy. We want them to have friends. We want them to have a sense of belonging in society. And usually a parent will say, I want them to be independent. I want them to have a sense of themselves and be independent. When we look at what students themselves, students with autism themselves want, we often hear that. You know, I want to do it with, I don't want people to do things for me. You know, I want to be kind of, and we're going to look a little bit in just a couple of moments, we're going to look at some research. Somebody who basically asked people with autism what they're wanting in relationships. And one of the common themes that came out of that was independence. And then, of course, what educators want for their students is we want our students to fit in. We want our students to meet their IEP goals. We want our students to be successful. And, you know, again, we usually want our students to be independent. So Jody Robledo is a colleague who did a dissertation in 2006 that then became an article down the road that you can look for her name. She's from California. And one of the things she said, you know, she asked in a variety of ways adults with autism. And these were people that spoke, that typed to talk. She met with people in person, and she did this over email and the phone. So that was kind of how she gathered the data. And then she looked for themes in the responses. And one of the themes was that what I want in any relationship is a shared vision of independence. Stephen Hinkle, who we have had in the Midwest on a couple of occasions, is a delightful colleague of mine with autism who actually is probably the first person that ever used the term hidden curriculum kind of before Brenda Smith-Miles, who of course has taken that term and helped us all understand about it. And what he said is, I want somebody to be a passenger assisting me to be the driver of my own life path. Okay? So that tells us how independence is important. to somebody with autism. Sue Rubin is a person who types to talk, initially with facilitation and now independently. And she, you may recognize that name as she's a person who wrote the story of her life. It was made into a movie, into a documentary. It was nominated for an Academy Award. And with the proceeds from the film, her foundation bought a copy for every public library in the country. So you can get it. The name of her movie is Autism is a World, and it's a wonderful movie. It's a great, you can put it on your summer list of things to do if you want. And what she said is, my staff pushed me to be able to do things with the least amount of support necessary. They are constantly teaching me that I must rely on myself first and then ask for aid if I'm not able to accomplish something on my own. I feel much more independent than I could have ever imagined, and that feeling alone is intensely gratifying. So we have to be careful about how we're, for those of you that are paraprofessionals that are attending, I think that it's easy as adults to get into habits. I watch it with my own so-called typically developing son. I can get in the habit of doing things for him that he is perfectly capable of doing on his own, but will allow, will kind of back off and let me do, and sometimes it's even more work to get him to do it on his own. But as a parent, I know that's important for him. So when we look at the most effective way for us to use our paraprofessionals, we're going to look in a couple of different areas. One is we're going to look at the current research and what that has told us about our outcomes, as well as this need for independence and self-determination on the aspect of our students. So one of the things, kind of one of the traditional ways we've used paraprofessionals, one-on-one is kind of a phenomena that's particularly common for students with more severe disabilities, those, what I call those deeper kids with autism that are there, but they're deeper in there. Maybe our students who are somewhat less verbal, our students that might have more behavioral or sensory needs, who are in, maybe those more complex bodies, and also our students that have good access to their cognition and verbal skills, but maybe their executive function, in terms of focusing and figuring out what's relevant and breaking down tasks, is not as strong for them, so that we use a one-on-one paraprofessional so they can access the general ed curriculum. Now here's the thing, is that it's one of the areas that we unite. Families and general educators and special educators, we all unite in requesting this, particularly if there are safety needs or challenging behaviors. Just again, that extra pair of hands, or that person that's responsible for this individual, makes us all feel less anxious about the situation, I think. The choice to use our paras is, kind of dependent on, sometimes on our resources and on the staffing availability.
And
you want to talk about that, Daniel?
Yeah, so, certainly the resources and supports and accommodations for a student with a disability, as determined by the IEP team, including the parent as a shared decision maker on IEP teams, is based on the unique needs of the students with the disabilities. That's the language you will hear us at DPI talking about in terms of compliance with the law. Saying cross-categorically, we don't provide, anytime there's a statement that we don't do blank at all for any students, for things that are common in other places, those decisions aren't being made. When a statement like that happens, a categorical statement for all students, that's not being based on the unique needs of a student with a disability. So it really is whether or not a student is going to receive a teaching assistant during part or whole of a day is an IEP team decision. It's based on those unique needs. It's not that the equation of what are the resources really that's not the crux of the discussion. Now, as we know, what I'll say is in the real world, another piece of this is there are many ways to get the same outcome. Yeah. So if you want to improve reading scores of a student, of any student, there's a lot of ways to do that. And there are some that are more research supported. There are some that have been shown to be more effective with certain types of students. So you look at those types of things. But when you're talking about a teacher assistant, you know, I would say for me the biggest concern with having an aide would be safety. I think that the teaching piece is obviously very important, and there's a lot. That's when I say they're a backbone of a good program. Is we're going to be talking about some good strategies for teaching assistants to assist with those, you know, helping students work on certain skills during the day, those types of things. That's fantastic. But you know, you really have to look at what are the different ways that that can be done, and we're going to be talking about peer-mediated supports. We're going to talk about teacher assistants helping, you know, a variety of students in the classroom, different types of structures, and really analyzing when is that needed. So I think the fear is that people think of it as an all or none, especially when we see a certain type of kid. We think, well, it's going to be an all or none. But really we have to be thinking, what are the needs, when are the needs happening, and that's what we're going to be discussing throughout this webinar.
Yeah. And I think also, you know, this point, thank you for that, Daniel, that was really great. And I think the other part of that point is that we also think that once we assign a certain percentage of the day to have, you know, adult assistants outside the natural supports, that's static. And, you know, we are hoping that by the end of this webinar, you will agree with us that it's dynamic, that it's changing. You know, I loved that part in the clip that Daniel showed us where that teacher said, you know, I just needed, I needed some paraprofessional support for this student just at the beginning of the year to get him settled in, to teach him the systems, and then we got that person out of there so that the student had an opportunity for self-determination and independence. And I mean, you'll hear us probably say this more than once tonight. I am coming to believe, and the research that we're going to talk about in just a moment is what has led me to this rather strong position, which is as soon as we put a paraprofessional or personnel support in place, we have to start asking ourselves what needs to happen so we can fade that person back.
Because our end goal is for these students to be skillful and independent as possible. And we know students, even with these pretty extreme needs, they may need some level of assistance, but there's going to be a lot of things that they can be doing independently. But we gotta work on that as early as possible. Great.
So, you know, when I first put this presentation together, and then Daniel and I merged it, I went out looking for research, and I had no idea. I'll be honest with you guys. I had no idea this was the research. I was absolutely stunned. I could not find any study that supported this rapid expansion of paraprofessionals from a research evidence-based, evidence basis. In fact, there are studies. One is Carter et al. In 1999, and they looked at students, and they were looking at the social piece and remembering that, you know, by our state criteria, autism, you know, our two yeses on our eligibility criteria are social participation and communication. So interactions with peers is got, you know, that should be in every single one of these kids' IEPs, you know, and that students that have an assistant with them have actually fewer interactions with their peers. And this becomes even more true in adolescence. And I mean, if you think about, if you think about the level that the age level that you support, you know, you can imagine that at the kindergarten and even, you know, 4K, 5K, even the first grade level, it's kind of an asset to have another person out there helping set up games on the playground or whatever. But boy, you start getting into that late elementary, you know, middle school, early high school, it is the kiss of death to have an adult too close to you. Because kids are doing all kinds of behavior that they don't want adults to see. You know, they're pushing those limits. They're becoming autonomous in their own personalities, and they're all trying out new behavior that isn't always school friendly. And, you know, we say there is no swearing at school, there is no kissing at school. You know, we have all these rules, but those aren't the real rules. The real rules are there's this set of behaviors that you only do if there isn't an adult that can see or hear you. You know, that's the hidden curriculum, what we would call. And so you got an adult too close to you and you're an adolescent, and it is going to be a force field around you. And, you know, consequently, a few years later, Brewer et al. Found the same thing, and they interviewed the students in that study, and the students themselves said they felt stigmatized. My favorite story about this is a young youngster who was in middle school, and I come in and I say, okay, you know, so what do we want to troubleshoot around, or what do we need, you know, what does the team want coaching around? And they said, well, he's been hollering, "Get away from me!" to his paraprofessional. It's like, well, yeah, he's an adolescent. The presence of the paraprofessional maybe makes that student feel different, and that's certainly not what we intend to have happen, but it certainly can happen. And research says it does. The other research that is really frightening to me, and this kind of comes to Daniel's earlier point about, you know, we often hear from our paraprofessionals and case managers alike that our paras are not getting the level of professional development that they feel that they need in order to do what they're being asked to do. They get kind of, you know, and somebody moves and we hire someone and we got to throw them in there. And so in fact, student achievement might even be hindered by paraprofessionals because they may not have had the extensive training in the daily interventions with those students, at least in that period of time of catch-up. And the Gerber study was a fairly extensive study in numerous school districts across numerous different programs, and they found that. And then, you know, Gian Greco, who's one of my favorite researchers, you know, found, of course, that our students have fewer opportunities for self-determination because things are done on their behalf. I cannot tell you, and I'm sure Daniel has seen the same, and you've probably caught yourselves or you know, staff on your own. You know, a student is reaching out their hand toward the doorknob, and somebody says, "Open the door." It's like, well, what do you think he was going to do with that door, with that hand going on the doorknob? Or his hands are going right on that light switch and somebody says, "Turn off the lights." It's like, you know, we just, especially with our kids who are less verbal, it's almost like I think that somebody did a study once, and I don't have it off the top of my head, but those of us that are kind of drawn to this field tend to be verbal auditory learners. And I think sometimes it's just uncomfortable being in that silence, you know, as we walk down the hallway or shadow a student down the hallway. And so we engage and we, you know, kind of direct where we maybe don't need to.
And I think sometimes, you know, people that go into education, and I would say I've known many teacher assistants in my day as you have, Kate, and these are kind people.
Oh,
these are people who
well-meaning,
are doing it because
so
they love the
well-intentioned.
kids.
Yes.
And we need people to love our kids.
Yes.
But we need that to happen in the appropriate places and times where it's not stigmatizing students. We also, I think sometimes, you know, just even having conversations as an IEP team of what are our expectations of the student, because sometimes when you see a student who's nonverbal, you don't really know, they may have difficulty communicating with basic communication. You really don't know what they're thinking because it's hard for them to communicate in traditional ways. Sometimes we make assumptions that they're not capable of these things. And I think that Kate and I sometimes forget because of our orientation where we have extremely high expectations for all students because we see the amazing things that students can do when they're well supported, students at all levels. And again, these aren't things that happen overnight, but over many, you know, sometimes even many years. But we know what's possible. That those, I just want to reinforce that having those conversations can be important because I think that we sometimes on a day-to-day basis we don't think the simple things we do to be helpful might actually, you know, for the parents, I've heard this from parents, parents that have children in their 20s and 30s go, wow, do I wish I had encouraged more independence when they were in kindergarten, in first grade, in second grade. But it was so hard because of that nurturing piece. And I think the same is true for our general educators, our special educators, our assistants. So it's not just our teacher assistants.
Well, and I think the other piece that comes into play here is the neurology of autism. I was making a home visit last night, and I was encouraging, these parents of an 8-year-old to encourage more independence. And we had the discussion that, with students that have other kinds of neurological setup, let's say, like my typically developing son, I never really had to think too much about independence except around a little lazy streak, because he started pushing me away at different parts because he became self-conscious and he wanted to do things himself. And that comes from that social awareness, okay? So our kids with other kinds of challenges and our kids that are neuromajority, I like to call them, are going to be socially geared to push us away and kind of strive for their independence. Whereas kind of the trump card, if you will, for our students with autism is system. What's the system, And if the system is always dad gets me ready for bed, or if the system is always mom feeds me this, or is always that the paraprofessional or teacher does this for me, ties my shoes for me, puts this on for me, says these things for, and then I can access it, that becomes what I'm used to. And that becomes the system that pops up in my head. And so I want it to stay, if I had autism, my autistic neurology would want that to stay the same. So we don't have that same guidance always from our students toward independence, yet remember at the beginning, as adults, people with autism are saying, we want independence, and we always wanted independence, but sometimes we have to help them kind of get over that hurdle of their systematic brain, if you will. So here's just, a couple of my favorite cartoons from the from the research, and that there's an island in the mainstream. Mrs. Jones and Mrs. Cooper are still trying to figure out why Fred doesn't feel like a part of the class. And isn't that sometimes the fact, that just how we set things up with our, because our paras are often laden down with all their extra materials and whatnot. So we want to just always make sure that we're finding a way that our paraprofessionals are enhancing the learning and not distracting from it. And then this is that adolescent comment. Joey noticed a mysterious force field around his assistant that children could not break through.
We're going to read a couple of pieces. So a couple questions. One of them, and Kate, I'm going to let you answer this. Do you think it's a good or bad idea to keep the same aide with the same student for multiple years if they're continuing to show improvement? What are your thoughts on that?
I'm old, and so I will tell you that I used to think it was a great idea. And there have just been way too many times in my career that I have seen a paraprofessional who said, I am absolutely, positively, beyond a doubt, going to be back next fall. And somebody gets transferred, or somebody has health issues, or somebody wins the lottery, or something happens, and that person doesn't return. And with that person, unfortunately, then go a lot of the cues and correction procedures that are helping that student to be successful. So not only do I say it's good to change it up, I also say I don't like one person with the same student all day long. I like to at least have that split between half days, and it's the same thing. And I think and I do understand that with some of our students that are very complicated learners, we might for a year or even two have the same person, but we're always looking toward that generalization to new and different staff. And I think there can also be a value when we have, more than one para providing the support. Then we've got, kind of the two heads problem solving along with the case managing teacher and the gen ed teacher and the therapist, So I think just to have that additional perspective, especially on some of the more complex students that we're seeing. You know, so I'm kind of a fan of, you know, not getting one particular paraprofessional attached to one particular student, but more letting it be, you know. Now I think it's really important from the student perspective, you know, if there is a change in personnel throughout the day, that is highlighted on his or her visual schedule. So it's not like, I don't know who's going to be with me in science today, you know, but it's that I know that I am supported for these parts of the day, and this is who my support person is going to be.
And I replied all to some of the comments on there, and I saw some nice trends. And really quick to go riff off what you said, Kate, one of the things that we did in one of the most effective autism programs I worked in, this was in Lawrence Public Schools in Lawrence, Kansas, where I started, and we were a big university town, sort of like a Madison-type place. Brenda Smith-Miles was teaching at KU at that time, and she wasn't necessarily involved in this program, but in any case, there's a lot of stuff going on, good stuff. And we, for our most significant students, a lot of times we did maybe have 3 or 4 people working with the student, but we shift them around.
Yeah.
And when you come in and you know, I'm going to work with Johnny for this amount of time, you can walk in there and go, we're going to do this. This is going to be great. And it's a student that has a lot of needs, and you do it, and then you get to go and you work with another student who may not have as much need for your energy and for you being really, really on. Because for some of our students, we have to be very on in our language and our body language and what we're doing to make that a really good you know, period of time or session for that student. And we would really think about who works well with certain students, match up things. And we did have people that worked with kids for 3 or 4 years, but not all day long for 3 or 4 years.
Yeah.
And, you know, and there's other considerations. We'll talk about scheduling, like, you know, it's hard to have a bunch of people coming in and out of a 2-hour science lab.
Right.
So you have to think about those things too. Some of the comments I saw, you know, there was some great comments, Kate, that people talking about, you know, sometimes just, you know, going back to some people feeling that that responsibility. Teacher aides have, and I have seen this, I have seen teacher aides so take on any difficulty the student has, they take it like it is their responsibility. And I was that type of person too, you know, and that's a great attribute, but we have to remind, you know, those teacher aides that sometimes students are going to have meltdowns, and it's how we act, it's how we engage, it's how we help them that is important. And sometimes, you know, we can't take all of that too personally.
And I think it helps us take it less personally if we're working with a variety of students across the day. And I know the argument that students with autism need a lot of consistency.
Yes.
And I will also say that some of them are very specific learners. You know, the DPI trainings, the 2-day ones we do, you know, people can come back and back and back. And a number of years ago, one of the behaviors of challenge that came up is that it was a student that only knew his multiplication facts if his teacher, if he was doing it with his case managing teacher and she had her hair straight down. If she had it in a barrette or back in a ponytail, he could not access those skills. So one of the values, while it might be harder to get consistency across the board as cleanly as we want, if we have multiple people supporting a student, it also is a way that it helps that autistic neurology be more flexible and generalize learning to more people. So, you know, that's kind of another way to look at it.
Another tip, too, we can be consistent in the language we use.
Absolutely.
We can be consistent in how we respond to behavior. We can be consistent using visual supports and visual schedules and peer supports and those things. So, you know, I'm not one to say, you know, you're going to have 10 different people working with the student every single day. No. But having 2 or 3 people rotate, I think, really works well. And it's going to build that more resiliency for that student. You want those 2 or 3 people to be on the same page with how they work with the student. But that is just part of working in a really strong team.
And probably, as Daniel said, you know, being respectful of the gen ed staff in terms of how we're doing our staffing. But also, I mean, it doesn't make sense to have 3 or 4 different people working with the same student in math, you know. So it might be that the schedule will remain the same and it will, you know, but the same person would maybe be supporting for the same thing.
And hopefully for any, for teachers, families, and teaching assistants out there, hopefully we're giving some permission for you to not feel like you have to have everything perfect for that student. There was an example once of look at a student, a neurotypical student, and then a student maybe with autism, and they have an assignment in class, and they have to have they have to have all of the information on the page done and put in the basket on the teacher's desk before they can go out to recess. Well, which of those students is probably going to have to do more work? The one with the teacher assistant. Because all the other kids might get 5 or 6 wrong, throw it in the basket and fly outside, but the student who has somebody working with them individually and feels that responsibility that everything has to be right might not be getting access to some of the other things the kids are getting. And I've heard that as an example, and I think there's a way to work around that. I'm not saying we just let students not make mistakes all the time and not assist them, but there's a balance there for sure. Just really we want to help students, and we hold them. The example I gave, sometimes we hold students on one-on-one to more demands. If you had to take a frequency count on the number of directions and demands that a person gets, and that's stressful.
Absolutely, especially if you have autism and your auditory processing isn't as reliable. And I think sometimes we have higher behavioral demands. Other kids get away with stuff. Other kids are non-compliant at certain times of the day. And again, a lot of kids learn the when and where of that so they don't get caught and they don't get in trouble. But we have to I think we just need to be careful about what we're...
And we're not condoning letting students do bad things.
No.
But we are just saying that there is a balance in helping students be independent. So some reasons to fade support is avoiding that dependence that we talked about in the research. And we're really looking at that social interaction with peers. There's so much, peers are such an amazing resource. So the neurotypical students, or other students with other disability areas that are not autism that don't have a social communication difficulty. There's many students with emotional and behavior disabilities that have extremely strong social skills in certain ways that can really benefit as peer models for our students with autism. In my experience, when that's structured. And then there's also that piece around the natural cues and correction procedures.
I want to talk a little bit about that last point because I think, one of the dynamics that I see sometimes, and I have that wonderful advantage if I get to go to a classroom and sit back and observe, and how many of you ever get to do that. And one dynamic that happens relatively frequently is a general ed teacher gives a direction or explains something, and then a paraprofessional re-explains or repeats that same, kind of direction or explanation to the student that they're supporting. And I have seen it where the student that is being supported doesn't even look at the gen ed teacher because that student knows it's going to be repeated by the paraprofessional. I have seen in a, kind of a learning, cooperative learning group where maybe desks are grouped together in 4 to 6. I have seen other general ed students not pay attention to the natural cue, which would be that general ed teacher, and wait for the paraprofessional to re-explain it to the student there who has autism. And so I think one of the places that we're really going to ask you to look today as we look at fading and kind of effective use of our and I'm saying not just paras, I'm saying personnel. I'm talking about just as much as a case managing teacher if I'm in there. It's the same, it's the same dynamic, which is my role is to get my student to pay attention to the natural cues and correction procedures. So first I have to say to myself, what are they? Okay, so it might be that gen ed teacher. It also might be the peers. There's some research that students take 75% of their cues from their classmates.
The one thing that we did and this was back in the 90s, the one big intervention we did was moving from telling our paras to give a direct prompt to the student. When the student wasn't sure what to do next, get out the math book, get the pencil, put your name here, do this, was to have the student ask the peer or to prompt the peer to tell the student. So sometimes the teaching assistant's job is actually to assist, and there's a really good module on peer-mediated supports. We did a webinar on that, and there's some other webinars that might address some of these strategies in more detail. But utilizing peers is huge.
Absolutely.
Huge.
Michelle Garcia Winter would call it thinking with your eyes. Just teaching kids to look next door and see what page that student is on. I mean, those are some of those hidden curriculum pieces that our students don't automatically know to do. And just, a little bit of pointing to the, instead of saying open to page 85, just point to the other students being open to page 85 and then point to the book, And what I usually say is the only one who should be using verbal cues with that student in a gen ed classroom is a gen ed teacher. If the student's going to get the verbal, it's going to come from that teacher. If the student is not responding to that verbal, then he or she needs to be cued into it. So maybe I've worked out systems between the gen ed teacher and the paraprofessional that the gen ed teacher kind of, gives a wink or a nod or a finger to the para so the para can cue the student to listen non-verbally. Or if the student isn't getting it verbally, then I think our paras and our support staff need to be coming in with non-verbal supports. I've even seen it.
So that could look like visual schedules. That could be touching a picture on the desk that has kind of the steps of what the student's going to do next.
Absolutely. Gesturing over to the peers and what they're seeing there. A written task analysis and checking it off.
Referencing a social story the student knows of what to do in a certain situation.
Using a video of this task being done. So, I think, Daniel and I could go on and on with visual supports because we're so into them. But, we just really want to avoid just repeating what the gen ed teacher is saying or even the special ed teacher is saying. I've often also seen it where they're talking at the same time, and I can't process two people at once, and I know our folks with autism can't. So it's also, go ahead.
What we were going to say is cost effective. It is for districts. That's not going to be one of the biggest ones that I am specific. I know that districts are hurting now, but that's something to realize. And I would even just say more efficient because, again, paraprofessionals have a lot to offer in reinforcing skills of students. And if you can maximize their unique ability to give one-on-one assistance, that can really help an entire school program. So
absolutely.
That's big.
Yeah. Well, and I think one of the things that happens, and we're going to hopefully teach you a way to avoid that, is that, if budgets get tightened, then some of our paraprofessional staff gets decreased. And it's like getting the rug pulled out from under us. If we're looking at every situation, every time we put a paraprofessional into place or personnel support into place, we're immediately looking at how are we going to get this decreased to the minimum. There will always be enough work. I'm not saying that we're going to, for that paraprofessional with other students, but with every time we put a personnel support in, we really need to be asking ourselves, how do we get out of this? What does the student need to learn so that we can get out of this? What are there some things that we need to change in the environment with peers or with gen ed, cues and correction procedures so that our students can be more successful. And also future opportunities for the student. The truth of the matter is the more independent our students become in school is indicative of how big their lives are going to be when they leave us. The bottom line is there are rarely, if ever, one-on-one models in adult services. So we do not do our students any favor, we do not do our families any favor when our students get used to learning in a one-on-one dynamic.
So we've kind of continued with this. This is my slide. Also, the academics are very important, but the social emotional piece is huge. So if you're thinking of students across the spectrum, but if you're thinking about some of your students who may have some of those academic skills or you're really putting a lot into getting those academics up, just know that for many of the outcomes for our students with autism, it's not that they are not capable of getting a job based on their resume, but it's the social emotional skills and the difficulties they have with all of that other piece where the natural supports, the peer supports, the social communication. And school is just the best possible place where you can practice these skills. But they do need to be taught. We're not saying just throw kids in there without support. We're not saying that at all. There's peer-mediated interventions. There's a lot of research. There's ways to do these things. to help students. So additionally, we'll just kind of move through these, I think, because we want to get into the supports piece.
Yep.
So let's just kind of move in here.
We already made that point. That's just kind of a fun slide to remind you about it, that we want their worlds to be big, and so we need to get them more independent, support them to be more independent. And it's, our goal for our paraprofessional staff is to work herself or himself out of a job with that student.
With that student, yep. All right, so some resources to implement. We do need training. Definitely, there are a lot of webinars. The Autism Internet Modules website is great. AIM website, I'll send the link in a little bit in the chat there. Great professional development, free information videos. There's some great videos from the Organization for Autism Research that have some general ideas too. We're going to talk a little bit about scheduling and pieces here as well, because scheduling is huge in how you think about scheduling. We've already talked about that importance of expectations of staff earlier, that is critically important, that teaching language, prompting, and ways of encouraging natural supports. So when do we fade? That's the big question here. Because that can be a little scary, for a student that has some significant needs. So Kate's going to kind of walk us through here when we look at fading a student.
Okay, so I say this is an IEP team decision. Okay, so we're looking at independence, and we're not looking at someone who has full-time, one-on-one, Velcroed assistance, going to not having an assistant at all. But we look at it systematically, and we're going to show you a form about that in just a second. Part of that key to, one of the keys to fading is we have to, what I say to paras is we have to ask ourselves, what does the student need to be able to do so that I don't have to be here? I just loved it, because I went to a school not too long ago, and one of the paras said, okay, Kate, I'm trying to fade out of recess. There's another teacher out there, so I don't really need to be out there. But as soon as I come in the door, the student wanted to come with me. So I came in the door and it locked after me, and then the student misbehaved because he knew I would have to come out to the playground and deal with it. So we talked about, well, what the student needs to be able to do is listen to the playground supervisor, and then we developed a plan that when the student, would do something that needed intervention, that with the familiar paraprofessional there, the playground assistant or the playground supervisor would give that student the direction, and then we systematically faded the para away from that. So now that student doesn't need it. So in that situation, it was a staff training and a student getting used to a new person.
When you say systematically fading, so kind of walk us through. So it sounds like at first the para is out there who the student is familiar with and is following directions from, with a person they don't know and is not listening to. That person they don't know is giving the direction, standing right next to that para. Maybe
Absolutely.
That para is giving a stern look or some nonverbal backup body language.
Or maybe even the familiar para is doing it first, and the unfamiliar person is just there.
Sure.
And then the unfamiliar person is closer to the student, and the para is still giving the directive. And then the unfamiliar person, who's now becoming more familiar, gives the direction. And then the para, is a foot away, and that person is giving the direction. Then 2 feet away, and and then 3 feet away.
So
and
you're
then
doing this over time. And for some students, I've seen this. Yeah, some students months, some students a day.
Yep.
And it really does depend. And you really have to know your students, and you want to fade. You want to just make sure you're kind of errorless. You're trying to fade those out with a very high probability that you're going to be successful.
Absolutely. And in this case, by the time I came the next month, it was done. And the parent said, I love it. And it freed up 15 minutes, because she could take her break at that time, and then she was available for something else, and the student was more independent.
So a big takeaway, it is planning. We're not just talking about, schedule change tomorrow, it's out. Mm-hmm. And then to get it back in, you have to have a meeting or something. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's just poor planning.
Yep. And we're gonna look at that again through the IEP. We're going to look at, what the student needs to learn on the other slide, kind of, does this student need to learn to use a task analysis independently? Does this student need to learn to make videos of the teacher directions and then, on his iPad and then watch them? Do they need to increase a peer interaction on this slide so that they can get that information? We hope that the paraprofessional, as part of the speech and language, but even broader, is setting up situations that encourage social participation on both sides. Yeah. And when that social participation is there, then, peers cue each other all the time. We don't want our students to only be the recipient of peer cueing, because then they become the class project rather than a classmate. But certainly, going back and forth.
This is where school jobs can be good. So how rooms are configured and desks and seating arrangements for elementary, I've had a lot of experience where you have somebody who's responsible for making sure everyone at the table is doing their job. And for many students with autism, that could be their job too, and they're going to be cued into those things a little more. So you can rotate those things and have some strategic ideas where you're setting up some of these natural supports.
Yeah. In my perfect world, we have it at every IEP team meeting that we have additional personnel supports in place. We say, where can we fade? We figure out which parts of the day lend themselves to support fading. So this is where we need input from our paraprofessional, from our general educators, from our case managing teachers, from our therapists, and from our parents. Oh, well, when they come in after recess and have milk break and listen to a story, the paraprofessional is usually able to sit in the back of the room. Okay, well, then that's maybe a good place to start, or, after the math explanation, once he gets going on his math, he doesn't need it. Or for older students, in the high school, in this particular aspect of the high school, whether it's walking to class, whether it's in the lunchroom, whether it's a particular content area that the student has strength in, or even just has this set of, for some of our kids that maybe are set up with kind of the teach work boxes that they can do independently in different environments, So we look at that and we decide that, and we target the times of day, and then we decide what cues we're going to use as a team, and we track the student's progress toward achieving independence. So we're systematic rather than reactive. So this isn't just like, oh my God, we're going to have less staffing next year. It's for all of our students we're looking at this. So then we decide, here's, that kind of, that hierarchy of cueing, verbal gestures, peer prompting, visual, and of course we're going to go heavy into the visual. And remember, we want to develop a method to track the student's progress in achieving independence. And so we might write IEP goals such as so-and-so will function independently of special education support for a certain % of the day or so many minutes of the day. We might say we'll respond to natural cues and correction procedures, or we'll function without additional special education support for 15 minutes of math 5 out of 5 days per week. So we're really writing goals toward independence. We want to use a data sheet in one of your additional handouts. Let me see if I can find it here. It looks like this, and it's the level of support grid. So you just, under that first column, you just write down, if it's a younger student, the class schedule, the activities for the day. So, calendar, language arts, milk break, recess, kind of whatever it is. If it's an older student, it's biology, homeroom, whatever it is. And then we assign a support number. And the support number, here's an example of a hierarchy of fading that support. So, maybe your number 1 is a provide support for the other students outside of the classroom for increased periods of time. So the 0 means they don't need any special ed support. Maybe the 1 is that I can provide support for other students outside of the classroom. A 2 is I can provide support for other students in the room for increased periods of time. 3 might be I can give that student a cue, or I can give them a visual and walk away for a certain period of time. A 4 is I can give a cue and walk away for a short period of time. And then the 5 might be Velcro. You know, one-on-one, I got to be right there.
So we're kind of looking at that sheet that you put out, and we're thinking of those numbers, and we're just going to look at the activity, and we're looking at the whole day, right? And you might, and families can do this, looking at their students at home and thinking of areas of, you know, when they come home from school, up to bedtime or in the morning. And we're just kind of looking at what level of support are we at and thinking of where we can go.
Absolutely. And I'm going to let you read those slides before that, you know. And then when we start fading, we begin fading where, you know, where we're already partway there. You know, we don't go from a 5, you know, well, maybe this is a student that needs absolute full support in the lunchroom or he falls apart. Well, then we're not going to start there. We're going to start with those 1s and 2s. And we're going to maybe try and bring those 5s and 4s down to 2s and 3s. Because I think the other thing is, it's like Daniel said, it's not all or nothing. You know, there are different ways of supporting a student and different levels of supporting a student. And I think that, you know, I would love it if one of your biggest takeaways this afternoon was this. There's nothing magical about this form. You can see, I put it together in about 5 minutes. But it's just, and you can use this form or make up your own, but it's just something where you are tracking the level of independence and writing goals for more independence and then tracking how you're getting there. In the comment section of that grid would maybe be needs a task analysis or needs a video, or, you know, kind of what is it that the student might benefit from to become more independent, you know, working toward asking a peer for support, or, you know, whatever it is, so that we always have a plan of getting ourselves out of it.
One of the big pieces that I keep finding come up is do an intervention not for the behavior or the time that is the hardest.
Right.
Start an intervention, use a social narrative, a visual schedule, a video modeling, peer support. Do it for something that the student needs a little bit of help with, and let's get him to be more, you know, him or her or him to be more independent. Start with things that are going to be successful, especially when you're introducing something new. That's kind of across the board. And then once you see some of these supports and finding which ones are really working well for that student, you can start then applying those to those more bigger areas that are maybe the biggest concern of the team or the family or the educators or everyone. But starting there sometimes is a mistake people make.
I agree, Daniel. And when you think about that recess example, and I appreciate that Daniel helped me be more articulate with it, because when you think about that, that paraprofessional had exactly the right idea. She'd heard my presentation. She knew what we wanted. We want, you know, and she was like, I think I can get out of recess. He can be independent at recess. But she was taking a little bit too big of a jump, and so we had to back it up, you know, and we had to get her, you know, from a 5 down to a 4, down to a 3, down to a 2, and then a 1, and then out. And it's that systematic nature of it that's going to appeal, I think, also to the learning style of our students with autism. So like as an IEP team, these might be some questions you'd ask. Is the student able to work independently for any amount of time? And if the answer to that is no, and for some of our students it really is, like no, they won't do anything, then we have to ask ourselves, well, what am I cueing him to do? So like one situation I had was the paraprofessional said, he won't do anything. He won't disrupt the class, but he just sits there, you know, and then so then we problem solved as a team. Well, what do you do for him? Well, I tell him the next step, or I write down for him the next thing he needs to do. So then what we taught that student is we did write down a whole task analysis of what he needed to do. And for several months, the paraprofessional pointed to what he needed to do, prompted him to get going, and when he got done, she made a little check mark by the sentence that said, you know, do number 1 through 5, you know. And then the second thing, you know, she'd point to it, you know, he'd have to read it, and then she would check it off. And then we went to him doing the checking off, you know. And then we went to her pointing to 2 things and walking away and him checking them off. So it sometimes has to be that systematic.
And sometimes for some of our students, you know, having a student maybe have some support working on an activity but then walking across the room to get an item off the shelf and engage in it independently. I mean, I've seen students with very significant disabilities be able to do something like that. So, you know, we have to think about what are those things, and then how do we embed, as you said, that greater independence. And sometimes our prompting is just moving from less verbal prompts. Someone made the comment earlier, less verbal is better. Definitely,
Pretty much
definitely.
100% of our learners with autism, less verbal is better. That was a great comment.
So writing out or showing pictures or showing steps of pictures in a step, and then modeling, as Kate had said, and that may take a lot of time to show those models. Video modeling is huge. You've probably seen that work sometimes immediately to help learners.
I haven't. I've been putting a lot of energy into teaching students to make their own videos while the teacher is teaching, to teach them, you know, because it helps that it supports that executive function when they're looking through their iPad or their flip camera, and then they've got that explanation and it's exactly the same, and they can listen to it over and over again. Some other IEP questions we might ask: does a student even know they need assistance? And these all came from questions people have asked me when I've done this presentation. And if not, then we need to teach them that they need assistance. And then if they know they need assistance, do they have a means of communicating that? Do they know who to approach when? You know, and this, you know, one guy had a paraprofessional because he kept interrupting the teacher, the gen ed teacher, when she was teaching, because he knew he needed assistance, he knew how to ask for assistance, but he didn't know who to approach when. So we just had to make that obvious to him. In that situation, we just used a visual system where the teacher started out and she just had this little thing that said open for questions, closed for questions. You know, she just had a sustained visual cue up for him. And then he started to learn, oh, when she's talking to everybody, she's closed for questions. When she's sitting at her desk and there's a line of students there, she's open for questions. So he started learning that. But initially, it was just that sustained verbal cue, and we were able to fade that special ed support out fairly quickly in that class once we had that in place for that particular student. So, you know, the difference between cueing and prompting, and this is all just bringing us to the point of remembering that for many of our students with autism and related disorder, verbal prompts can be very difficult to fade. They get learned into the task, and even when the capacity to be independent is there, the neurology doesn't allow it because it needs that verbal cue in order to access the skill. So what I like to say, and I think Daniel agrees with me, is prior to teaching a task, we have to ask ourselves, is this a task we want the student to ultimately do without a verbal cue? And if the answer is yes, please do not put the cue in to begin with. So everybody line up for lunch. That's going to always be there, right? Teachers are always going to tell kids to line up for lunch. Open your book to page 42. You know, pick a partner. Those things, that's fine to have as verbal cues. But, you know, open your locker, get your backpack, unzip your backpack, get out your folder, put your folder in the basket, blah, blah, blah. That's something that we don't want to have verbal cues ever, ultimately, so that means we don't want to have them ever.
I heard a really interesting kind of analogy talking about hidden curriculum. So when we say something, what does that really mean? And for some students, we're going to have it's time for a spelling test. Well, for some students, many students in the classroom are immediately going to open up their notebook, get a piece of paper, write their name on it, write 1 through 20, and wait for the first word. But for some of the students with autism, we're going to have a spelling test. It's time for your spelling test. It's like, okay. And then and then the paraprofessional is telling them, get out your head. Good point. And so, you know, one way to think about it is it's time for the spelling test. If there's things like that where there's a whole bunch of extra information that other students are just doing, kind of task analyze that. Write out those steps and figure out, can we, if a student's a reader, just listing those students and steps in front of them or her can help. If the student's not, is there a way to do that with pictures? Is there a video model? Is there a peer support where, again, even if the peer is providing those prompts to the student, that is going to be better than the para.
Yeah, and it's maybe just that hidden curriculum piece of when the teacher says it's time for our spelling test, it means, you know, get out your paper, get out your pencil.
I heard
you know,
Judy
yes,
use that example.
That's
I
a
think.
great one. The other thing to remember is research supports heavily, heavily, heavily for decades that telling anybody what you want him or her to do versus what you don't want them to do increases the probability that they'll demonstrate the preferred behavior, much more so for our students with autism. So to say, you know, stop screaming or stop kicking or don't do this is most likely or is possibly going to increase that behavior and the strength of that behavior. Saying, you know, feet on the floor, you know, use your, you know, 10th grade voice or whatever it is that we want them to do. So that's just kind of, please don't tell students not to do something. And stop is not a, you know, unless they're like running in the street, you know, but stop doesn't, you know, the other thing that Judy has taught us is that we have to use language that's going to create a picture, and stop doesn't, but feet on the floor does. You know, hands in your lap does.
So things that the student can visualize and see versus an abstract word, like,
right.
You know, calm down sometimes is not helpful, or,
right.
you know, it's take a deep breath. So those actionable, literal things.
Yes.
We had a good question talking about, you know, what about some prompts like what should you be doing right now? What do you need? So asking kind of those questions when you can see a student so that they're then able to, you know, practice communicating what it is they may need.
The only thing I would say around our students with autism I'd be a little cautious about is that we, as educators, we make a lot of tasks about communication that don't need to be about communication. So we might say, you know, think about what you need to do, but then remember, if that's a verbal cue, then that student might not only be able to access that ability to think about what you're going to do. I know it's very, very good practice with other kinds of learners to use indirect verbal cues, absolutely, and to require a verbal output. But for our students with autism, many times that will make the learning more difficult for them. So we really want to think about, are we adding a communication component, remembering communication and social participation are the two hard things for this group of learners. You know, do we really want to make this about socializing? Do we really want to make this about communication? You know, if it's a, you know, I saw a youngster recently and he is a math whiz. He is going to do great things in the math world, I have no doubt. But he was getting a D in math because one of the requirements was to follow directions such as after you get a math problem solved, you have to turn to your partner and explain to them how you did it and then tell them 2 other ways you would come up with that answer. So we've taken something easy for him, math, and we've taken the most difficult thing for him, communication and social participation, and we've embedded that in math. So we have to be, I think we have to be a little cautious about that with our learners with autism. Not that we would never do it, but I might be more, I don't know that that's going to lead us to independence.
Yeah, and I think it depends on the situation. You know, if it's something that's working, that's fantastic.
Yeah, if it's working, keep doing it.
And also thinking of the goals, if you're trying to get the student to be able to think about what they need and be able to articulate, there can be some pieces with that.
Yeah.
Certainly. Yeah. So, you know, I'm going to kind of push through this. This gets us into kind of that positive. So, you know, that slide on positive psychology previously really just talks about what Kate said is focusing on the positive. So instead of trying to get students to stop doing something, so stop shouting out in class, stop running down the hallway, stop, we need to tell them what to do. And that follows positive behavior intervention supports. That follows a lot of the things that are happening. And there's a movement in positive psychology that kind of talks about that a little bit. And it focuses on what are those skills that are really helpful for students. So, you know, one example, actually I will just really quick talk about, you know, example of I had a student who was shouting out answers in class. So when I tried to do a traditional intervention of explaining to that student that they can't shout out, for many students, that can work pretty quickly. For this student, it did not. The student did not have autism, but it was a student who had some behavior difficulties. And so what I did is I said, well, you know, why do I think the student is shouting out, and how can I functionally assist that student? So I just gave the student a whiteboard and said, just write down what the answer is and hold it up. The student really wanted just my approval. He wanted to show that he knew the answer. So I did that. I allowed him to share his answer in a way that was not disruptive to the rest of the class.
Beautiful.
And was more appropriate. And it was something that I knew that mature-wise he would be okay, and eventually I could live with that option for them. So sometimes we're looking, but what I did is, you know, I taught him and reinforced. I didn't say stop doing something. I said, you know what, I want you to use this to write your answer, and then I really reinforced him writing down his answers and sharing them with me. And if I wanted to, I could have shaped that into him writing them down and handing them to me at the end of class or something like that. But just thinking of focusing on what the replacement can be. Some big pieces, visual timers, huge. You know, if you're working with students who need assistance of when to do things, visual supports, visual timers, visual schedules.
So Linda Hodgdon's been around for a good long time, and she's the one that taught us, if we find ourselves or others who support this student or family members saying things like any of these quotes, he's inconsistent, she doesn't pay attention, she just wants what she wants when she wants it, you know, she can't handle change, she'll only do things, you know, it's her way or the highway, he's very manipulative, you know, he tunes out all the time. That's warning signs. That's our language telling us that student probably needs more visual supports and less verbal input. And you guys can all read, and so I'm going to just let you see there's, of course, many different functions of visual supports. We can use it receptively to provide information, to support that memory, organize the environment, the sensory system, to enhance both receptive and expressive communication, even in our verbal students, to facilitate overall learning, to support choices, to support and enhance relationships, to promote competence, to enhance lives, to support executive function. It can just go on and on and on, and they can include all of these things and more. And we're going to show you some examples, so we won't spend too much time here.
I would say it is very important to use visual supports for your verbal students and even your highly verbal students.
Yep.
Students that can tell you everything about what's happening next and when and where and what. Don't assume that a visual support will not add additional assistance for that student's anxiety and clarification, because those big meltdowns, sometimes they're about that one thing, but sometimes they're also happening because they're building up. And the more visual supports we can have, and universally people really do well with visual supports, the less stressed we all are.
Absolutely. Judy Endo says, you can fade the visual supports in your students with autism as soon as you're willing to not have your Google Calendar, or still have a paper calendar. So we can use written words, we can use kind of line drawings, board maker or Google images, we can use photographs. Many of us learned in college that photographs are lower inference than line drawing, so we assume that that would be easier for our learners, but some of our learners with autism, that's not the case, because their executive function doesn't support perception of foreground and background, and they do better with line drawings, and it's just a trial and watch. For some of our learners, they need to still convert the written word into a picture in their mind. And for some of our adolescent learners that would maybe do better with pictures, they prefer words because they think pictures infantilize them. So this really has to be student specific. So one of the things that, you know, I like to do, and Daniel came up with this great visual for us, is to think about what are the hurdles for independence. And a group activity that you can maybe do after the webinar today, or when you get together with your team, is to brainstorm where are the hurdles for the students you support in terms of independence. So it's the answer to, you know, I would fade out from this student, except I have to be there because, you know, he has trouble with transitions, with task completion, with safety, to interpret his communication, etc. So for instance, and then I'm not sure we'll get through all of these, so I'll just tell you. So then the system is this. So the hurdle is, we look at those 5s or even those 1s and we say we can't get all the way out on that level of support grid because he doesn't independently transition, and then we problem solve around that. Well, here's some ideas of promoting independence around transitions. We could pair sensory, because sometimes our kids get dysregulated. We have to look at the function. What is it about the transition that's difficult? Is it because, at least in part, he becomes sensory dysregulated? Then we would pair sensory regulation activities with transitions. So maybe having them push a cart down the hallway or carry books, or making sure that we incorporate up and down stairs in that transitions. We maybe take a longer path to the destination just to get in more walking. Maybe we do hopping or wheelbarrow walks, or we ask our OTs of some other ideas, We do visual schedules. Sometimes our folks don't know, they don't have a picture for what's coming next, and that's what makes the transition hard. So it might be, a first then, it might be, kind of a whole schedule. This is a schedule that we did, and this is a good time of year to talk about transitions for next year. This is one that we did for a student that was going from 5th grade to a new 6th grade building. He and I took his schedule. We went up and we took the pictures, and then we put them together in the order that he was going to do it. I guess we don't have the whole thing here, but starting with this is a door you're going to use, right down to this is the person you're going to see in the office, here's your hallway, here's your locker, here's your first class, the number on the door, the teacher's name, and the name of the class in the order it was going to happen. So PowerPoint presentations are wonderful for our kids. We might foreshadow using the video technology, the video modeling, using visual schedules helps in those transitions, PowerPoint, social narratives help in those transitions, taking a part of one activity to the next. Some kids have their own guys, we call them, or just their transition objects, that they carry with them all day, and sometimes it's just taking part of math to science, and then when I get into science, you can put the math item away, and then science to the next thing.
I mean, I can't think, there's so many times when I'll be early in the morning and I'll look, I'm like, where am I going? What am I doing?
Absolutely.
And if I have a coffee cup in my hand, I'm like, oh yeah, I was going to get coffee. So if you think about it, sometimes students, it's a constant reminder of, hey, this is what's happening next. So I really think we way underutilize transition cues. Mm-hmm. Handing a student a piece of the next activity. I know Jen Townsend told me that once. It's like, give the student a piece of the activity that's happening next. And it can serve so many functions, but that predicting is huge. And that's one thing I wish I had done more when I was working in schools, is use those transition items.
I had a guy that came up with, he had a visual schedule on his iPod, and he was a high schooler, and he then chose a song to go. So like it was one song that took him from this class to, one song that took him from homeroom to Phi-Ed, and then a different song that took him from Phi-Ed to biology, and on down the day. And so he always knew where he was going based on the song that was playing, and it was a different song for each transition.
I love that.
Yeah, so that was kind of a fun, unique thing that he did.
Theme songs from going from one place to another. The empty desk syndrome is, students get stressed when they wait. We know from the Groden Stress Survey, which is a stress survey, and there's some research from the Groden Center, that waiting is a big stressor. And so empty desk syndrome is when you're sitting at a desk not knowing what to do, whether or not a teacher assistant's with you. So, making sure that you have transition items, transition activities. Maybe there's a folder of things to do when you're waiting if you're at a desk. Maybe there is some type of device or thing. If you see a lot of adults with autism, I see at various times they just plug in the earbuds, middle and high school, that's going to be a lot more developmentally appropriate than, other types of options perhaps. So
one of my new favorite transition activities that I've been doing with lots of the folks that I support is putting the app Breathing Zone on their iPad, which is a visual app of deep breathing. And they literally just every time they, at when they finish a transition, whether the teacher is there or not, they do the breathing zone for X amount of time. And it also, supports that executive function, helps them relax. Let's do one more quickly, and then we'll let you kind of see the other ones on your own. So maybe a hurdle is that the student needs me there to prompt every step of the task, or otherwise he or she would just sit there. So let's think about, so then if that was why you couldn't get that 5 down to a 4 or that 1 down to a 0 or anything there, so then this is kind of the example that I already gave of maybe we would write the visual task analysis and we would check it off initially. And then over time the student would check it off, and maybe even over further time the student would learn to write pieces of the task analysis. We might write all the first, number 1, get out my pencil, number 2, get out my paper, number 3, put my name on the paper, number 4, whatever it is. This is what the task analysis would say, not that I would be saying that. Then, start checking it off and teaching the student to do that. The video technology made by staff, the pre-made ones, and my newest favorite one is to have the students make it themselves, is really great. Some other things that might promote independence are, the visual task analysis of, you have one there of, putting all my recess stuff on, or my going home stuff on, taking it off. And I put that kind of horizontal one in there. Do we have these?
Yeah.
Yeah. Because I don't know why some students seem to perceive vertical task analyses better and some seem to perceive horizontal. I've never understood that. I just know that for some students, their one works clearly better than the other. And some kids it doesn't matter. And you know your learners. So we might do that. We might do an organizational chart. These are some charts that were made for a student. For the ones that we want to get out of, Lights, Camera, Autism is a book I was lucky enough to help author, and it's got a DVD, and it's got, a washing hands PowerPoint, shoe tying, and seatbelt video that you literally just take the video and show it to the kid and be quiet, and it just is amazing how quickly sometimes they can become more independent.
Let's finish up with this hurdle, because I know this is one that people, even if for a recording, they would be interested in. The adult needs to be there to manage the student's behavior. So, we hear that a lot. This is where a good functional behavior assessment comes in, an FBA, and getting people in there. An FBA can be review and revised. It's not something that has to be done once every 3 years or once a year. If it's not working, the behavior plan that you put together in a functional behavior assessment, if it's not working, it's time to go back to the drawing board. And it doesn't mean you get rid of everything. It just means you adjust. Maybe you add. You're looking at what's going to be supporting that student to make them or him more skillful. So we just really want to look at that. Some other pieces with this too. With the behavior piece, relationships are huge. Finding people that student connects to and has a relationship with can totally change a student's day. And I have been sometimes that person, and sometimes I have had a difficult time building relationships with students. And, we have to have honest conversations about that. And that's where that strategic scheduling of staff sometimes can come in too. Sensory regulation can be a big piece with students that have a lot of behaviors that interfere with learning and sensory difficulties. So there's some great sensory regulation information, and again, there's some other resources and information, webinars that we've done on those topics as well. Again, visual schedules kind of outline things for students. So we're kind of getting at the end of our time. Feel free to type in a question. We'll still answer it, even though we're kind of out of time for people that are interested. There's some really good information in your slides of some different strategies. So now we're going to talk about scheduling of pairs. And when you're scheduling pairs, there's a couple things. And I always kind of think that the scheduling is the key, because we're not looking at getting rid of pairs. We're just looking at maximizing their efficiency, really utilizing their strengths, and thinking about it. So we're thinking of the student, we're thinking of the skills and attributes of that pair and relationships between that pair and that student, as well as the interests of the student and the interests of that teacher aide or para. So thinking about the student's needs, you have to think about safety needs, right? There are some students who certain people are going to really have struggles working with because of the behaviors that might come out of that student.
Absolutely, and I recently had that where I had a para who went skiing and broke her arm. And then there was a student that, kind of grabbed at people's arms, which not in a way that was hurtful, and it was getting better over time. But it's different if you grab somebody's arm that isn't broken, and if you grab a broken wing, So we had to look at rescheduling her, for the period of time,
And I've had it as a principal. I remember I had and I wasn't even aware of this. I had a teacher assistant come to me almost shaking after working with a student who had a lot of behavioral needs for a couple months, and I thought she was doing great, and said, I think I took the wrong job, and I think I'm so sorry, because she was specifically hired. And I said, no, wait. I could see that this person had a lot to offer, and we just made some adjustments as a team, Again, it was, okay, where can we fit this person's strengths? Maybe at some point down the line, this person's going to be a little more confident, or the student's going to be a little more skillful and less challenging for this specific person. So we really, I think we can be very strategic when we're thinking about scheduling with those students who have those more significant needs. Thinking of the student needs, we talked previously, what is happening during that time of day, right? And during that section. You don't want someone coming in and out of a 2-hour reading block necessarily, or in the middle of a social studies lesson is the hardest, because you may not know what's going on, the new person coming in, to be able to possibly skillfully assist that student as the student may need. So you have to think about that time of the day piece for sure.
And I think, one of the things I hear from our gen educators, which might be something that we would eventually want to put in our considerations, is that it is hard to have a different para in there every day with a student, because then the gen ed teacher has to end up teaching that para, kind of catching the para up. So I think that we have to have the lowest impact on that gen ed classroom as we can too. And I think sometimes just having consistency. There are days we can't help it. Somebody gets sick or something. But I think that if we can be consistent in the same people supporting students in the same content area, that really alleviates a lot of issues. And as you said, Daniel, not breaking it up. And I think, we talked earlier, but I just want to highlight that, 2 to 4 paras rotating throughout the day in a systematic way, where there's predictability for the student and their picture and their name is maybe right in the schedule, so I know who's going to, if I'm the student, I know who's going to be supporting me. But I think and as we talked about earlier, it maybe supports that flexibility of being able to access skills across a variety of people, which can be helpful for our students.
And definitely. And we had discussed too, those shorter sections of time, when it is not disruptive to the setting that the student is in or to that student, and it makes sense that you're doing these different activities, like we're going to work on, this specific skill here, and then we're going to go over to another part of the building and work on this skill, and then we're going to do this skill. And if those are things that are happening in 30-minute breaks, you can do some of those rotations. But having that common language, and I love what you said about that visual schedules, of putting the picture of the person there so that they can see who's coming next and utilizing that. The skills of the teaching assistant or para, I definitely have had people that, we had one guy who just was really good with teaching students how to ride a bike and how to play kickball and how to do a lot of physical related things. I've had other people that had strengths in music class or specials or art or things like that. So you really have to think about that as well. You have some people naturally have different patience levels and different abilities. There's some people that are very loquacious. So you might have that person doing something like a lunch bunch, if that's appropriate for that person to be interacting, although we always encourage that the students are doing most of the work, but versus a time when you're trying to fade out the verbal.
I love it, yeah. Well, and I think one of the ways that we can get some of the consistency, across people and across activities that we haven't talked about this afternoon is that's another really great use of video, is, to videotape the para that has the particular creativity or patience or, physical skills or whatever, so that we can see what is it that that person is doing that is being successful with this student, because maybe another para, if I watch that, as a paraprofessional, then I would be able to access those skills in myself too. So that's a way that we can get more of that creativity.
Relationships are huge.
Yes, I love that.
We're both on this, definitely on the same page.
Mm-hmm.
And there, that kind of, we talked about this as well, but really looking for students, especially students that maybe doesn't have a good relationship with some of the people in the building. Every time we can find someone. Now, we don't want to overburden some of our staff. Sometimes you find the people that are really good at building relationships always get, scheduled with students who have a lot of needs, and those people, that can be hard for that staff person.
Yeah.
So we have to be sensitive to that. But really finding people that, and actually talking about how do we build relationships with students? How do we share interests? How do we do things that can build those relationships? Do you have any suggestions of what you've seen to work well?
Well, I think what I just said, about watching people who have successful relationships, but I love, this is a slide that Daniel put together, and I love this slide that, those that have the paras that have those deeper relationships can do, kind of some of the more challenging activities, and then somebody who's just getting to know a student or who has not had as successful of a relationship, doing some of those highly preferred activities. And, I think we can do a lot working with kids' passions, and Paula Cluth and Patrick Schwartz have that great book out, Just Give Them the Whale, about working with passions. And that can be I think that can be a really nice avenue in with students. I think being quiet is always, I have not known a student with autism for whom being quiet was not useful.
Yeah. I know
in the relationship
sometimes
piece.
I would just sit and just having kind of silence together,
Mm-hmm.
And I could see that bonding
Yep.
with some students for sure. Great. And then interests, matching students and staff that may have similar interests so that those they can share those maybe more genuinely. We always encourage that there's a time and place for student-staff interaction, and for a high school student, our middle school students or even our upper elementary or different levels, we want to make sure that those are happening at the right time and place so that they're not being ostracized from their peers, et cetera. But certainly it's always good, just like for general education teachers know this as much as anyone in families, that when you share your experiences with someone, that can be really valued and they'll see you differently.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Nice.
Couple wrap up as we finish up here. So some key ideas to keep in mind. Make a plan. If there's one thing, we have talked about fading para support, but we have not just said that we should do that because it's not effective. There is some research that show it may not be as effective, but that doesn't just mean get rid of it.
Yeah, you don't pull the rug out.
What we're suggesting is that you're planning on what supports that we know are out there that we can use to scaffold the support that teacher assistant has been providing previously.
That it's maybe a temporary rather than a permanent support. And the next slide has just one sample of a plan, that you might use down the side. You can see are the short-term objectives or the benchmarks on the IEP. And then it would be, what class are those going to be in? Is it gen ed, resource, community? And then what are the modifications and adaptations for that student? So this, if I was a paraprofessional, I could pick this up and I would know exactly how to support a given student in a given situation. And, the nice thing about that is we might speak this to our paras, but, it's so nice to have it mapped out and written in the event somebody's out sick, somebody, quits their job or whatever. So I'm kind of a big proponent of doing mindful planning. And always, as much as possible, we want to collaborate with our student And it's going to increase the possibility of the support working, particularly around, kind of supporting social skills and peer interaction as a way that we fade. Our students need to be part of that process, because if they help us make a support, if they help us determine a support, there's a better chance they're going to use that support.
Another piece, to foster independence, you likely will need to add additional support. So we can't just pull something out, we need to bridge it instead of a cliff. So that's just a really big piece here. And if you do pull support, so what happens if someone listens to this webinar, they come up with a plan, they pull some support, and it just backfires? Do you have any kind of suggestions on kind of where you're at or what you would see there?
Well, I think it would be less pulling the support and more, as whatever you're scaffolding with gets stronger, you slowly, systematically fade that support. So if it backfires, then I would just go back to the drawing board and say, okay, that didn't work. What did I learn from that? And what might we be able to do differently? So if I tried a written support, I might try a video support. If I tried a video support and it backfired, I might think, what is it about the video support? Is he not looking at the video? Maybe it's too overwhelming. I might try still pictures. I've had to work with kids to teach their neurology to watch a video because they're so visually perceptive that it overwhelms them and makes them nauseous. So I think there's all different kind. It just keeps teaching us more about the student, I think. Even with our supports that seem to fail, it's just another piece of information.
So connecting families, and this is a slide from functional behavior assessments, but it applies definitely to just connecting families with what's happening, making sure that families know about this, that they understand the research that we discussed at the beginning of this. I think families are just saying, this teacher assistant that is really doing great things with my child, and I know my child is safe with this person, has got to be scary for families that they're talking about.
Yeah.
But what Kate was saying is talking about what is the process for this? What is going to replace the supports the teacher assistant has been providing? So how, really making sure families understand, okay, we're going to use a visual schedule, and we're going to teach this visual schedule, and the things that person was doing to tell the student what to do, the student's now going to be able to do it on their own with this visual schedule. And we're going to be able to document that and show you that progress, and it's not going to happen overnight. So we're not just pulling this person out overnight. That teacher assistant is going to be really involved in teaching that visual schedule. So thinking more strategically, more long term. Because I think usually what happens when there are those fears and disagreements, it's because from one year to the next, something drastic has happened. So we're really looking at bridging. You end up not having that as much. But it is important to share a lot of that research.
And in a lot of my districts, I've done this same presentation for families, as well as for the special ed and general educators. And I think that it's just good to get that information out there.
It's definitely good to know from the family. Is going to be great at telling you what that student can do independently at home, because the educators need that information to help think about how they can apply that to the school setting. So that's going to be some other additional ways. Scheduling IEP meetings a few months out. So you don't have to look at this and wait a year. You can call an extra IEP meeting, or you can actually schedule one when you're discussing this in an IEP meeting, and say, what, we're going to take some data, and 2 months from now we're going to sit down again and we're going to look at it. Maybe it's 1 month from now. However long the IEP team thinks they need for whatever kind of supports to kind of take effect and root. And then rediscuss and see where they're at. I've included some statewide in Wisconsin parent organizations that can help you and assist you. And then in addition, we just want to remind people that there's lots of good stuff from the National Professional and Development Center on Autism Spectrum Disorder. So there's a website there for them, and they have all of these evidence-based practices we've talked about today. You can see them there. They actually added 4 or 5 new ones recently. I'll be updating my list here in 2014-15. And there's some pretty neat new evidence-based practices that I'm excited to talk about next year. They have steps for implementation and implementation checklists, so that information you can actually sit there and look at how has this research been shown to effective for students with autism. It's important to keep in mind, note that you still might have to adjust some of those interventions depending on the student. Autism Internet Module is another great site. There's a screenshot. You can sign up for a free account. They actually are in the process of developing some of their modules, but they have most of the MPDC modules and a whole bunch of other stuff on there. So there's the web link for Autism Internet Modules as well. All right. Well, please take the survey as you follow up with the webinar today. That will help us provide additional webinars and information in the future, and we value your time. Kate, thank you so much for being here today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. It was a delight. And thanks to everybody who tuned in. Hope to see you again at another DPI training or webinar.
Thank you, and take care.